We'll start with the logistics of exam 3. So exam 3 is going to include blood, heart, blood vessel, respiratory, and digestive. So we kind of lump the blood, heart, and blood vessel into one. So you'll see like cardiovascular, respiratory, and digestive. So those three topics seem, very simple, and because there's only 3, but it's not, it's quite, detailed. So do make sure that you set aside enough time for these. So we'll start with the lecture. Lecture is the same as the previous exams that you've taken. So there are 50 questions. The first 40 are multiple choice, and they are divided evenly amongst the chapters. And the last 10 are write-in. Okay. You have 1 minute per question. Unless you qualify for the extended test taking. What else? Any questions about the lecture exam? Okay, they will be available first thing on Sunday, so midnight Sunday, until Monday at 11 p.m. Central Standard Time. Okay. And then for lab, same thing. It's going to be 30 questions. And all 30 questions are identification. You have to type in the answer. And spelling counts. Okay. Same thing in terms of the setup. Any questions on the lab exam? Okay, so for both of them, you will need to have respondus lockdown. With the webcam. And I'm not sure if the webcam is just the respondus lockdown is being a little bit more picky, but I've had a lot more students be flagged. So just make sure that you do a really thorough environmental scan. To give you an example, on the last exam, there were a few students who looked to the right of their, of their screen, and they didn't scan the right side of their screen area. So I didn't know whether that was an issue or not. So just to be sure to scan both your right and your left, just give me the overview things. And again, I don't ever look at these environmental scans unless respondus lockdown flags that session. Okay, so please, 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 for your benefit, do a very thorough environmental scan. Any questions on that? Okay. So we'll go right into it. So the first portion that we'll talk about is the cardiovascular, which includes blood, heart, and blood vessels. So we'll start with blood specifically. Make sure you know the functions of blood, the components of blood, as well as red blood cells and white blood cells, plasma, and then the heart, and then the blood vessel structures. Okay. So of those, we're going to start with blood first. So there was a request for blood components and production. So I'll start with the components. So with blood in the components, what you can do is that you can run a hematocrit. That's where you draw blood and put into a tube. And then you put into a machine called a centrifuge. Looks like this. So you put the tube in, and then it spins the tube. Because when you spin the tube, the components of blood separate based on density. In other words, like the heaviest goes to the bottom, the lightest goes to the top. So what you'll find at the end is that the blood is going to be separated like so. Okay, the heaviest is going to be on the bottom. And what is the heaviest component in blood?
Erythrocytes.
Perfect. And I love that you use the term erythrocytes. Also known as red blood cells. Okay. And then in the middle, kind of a yellow substance. And you don't have to worry about the color. I'm just finding a way to differentiate it. What will you find? In general, we call it the Buffy coat. And what you find in here includes white blood cells or leukocytes and platelets. Okay. Then everything in the top, what would you call that?
Plasma.
Perfect. What's the most abundant?
Plasma.
Yeah. And it makes up what percentage?
55%.
Perfect. The Buffy coat is less than 1%. And that leaves the red blood cells as?
45%.
Perfect. Okay. So that's the basic components of blood. You've got the plasma making up 55%, then the white blood cells, leukocytes, platelets making up less than 1%, and then the erythrocytes or red blood cells making up 45%. Okay. So we'll talk a little bit about red blood cells, unless, well, actually there wasn't a request for it, so it can be really detailed. Do you want me to go through the red blood cells or move on to the next component that you asked for? If there was something here that you want me, if you want me to cover it, just type yes or say yes. Okay. So with the red blood cell, you should know the shape, some terms that go with that. Can you tell me what they are? How would you describe the shape of a red blood cell? So that's the side view, and here's the top view. So use some terms, share some terms with me.
The concave.
They're what? Concave, yes. Concave. And actually, sometimes we use the term biconcave because it dips in on the top and on the bottom. So we use the term biconcave. Perfect. Okay. And think of it as like a donut. It's donut shape. Because you know I relate everything to food. Okay. Why do you think it's biconcave? Why do you think it's a donut shape? Why is the center hollow or kind of like dips inward? What explains its structure? What is normally found inside of in the middle of a cell?
A nucleus, and the red blood cells don't have a nucleus.
Perfect. That's the connection between structure and function. So there's no nucleus in here. That's why it's biconcave. Now, if there's no nucleus, that also means that there's no what? What do you find in the nucleus?
DNA.
Yeah. Thank you for so many replies. I love hearing students' voices. So there's no DNA. And if there's no DNA, there's no repair because you need DNA to repair your cells. And if there's no repair, that means is it going to have a long or short lifespan?
A short lifespan.
Yeah, that's right. And that's why we remember the name, I'm sorry, the number 120. So it survives for about 120 days before it's broken down. Okay. Now, what is the function of red blood cells?
To carry oxygen and carbon dioxide.
Perfect. Carry gases, oxygen and carbon dioxide. Okay. Now, if the purpose is to carry oxygen, what process do you know in your body that uses up a lot of oxygen?
Respiration.
Not expiration itself. Expiration removes the oxygen, it removes the air. So, and not ventilation either, because ventilation is including expiration and inspiration. So inspiration just brings in the oxygen. But what actually uses the oxygen in your body? But you're really close. Why do we breathe? This is a really important phenomena. So a lot of people think like if you like you see how like in movies they suffocate someone, they're like, oh no, you can't breathe, you're gonna die. That's not true. You don't actually have to breathe to survive, because people who can't breathe can get tubes medically, can have medical devices that will bring oxygen to their body. So it's not the action of breathing itself, but it's the mechanism of bringing oxygen into your body. So it's the oxygen that's needed, not the expansion, and contraction of your lungs. So it's not the breathing process that's important for life, but it's the oxygen. Why is oxygen important? What does your body use oxygen for?
Brain function.
The rest of the body,
To do what?
to oxygenate the rest of the body, to the muscles, to everything.
There you go. So think of like a laptop. If it's not connected to the outlet, it doesn't run. Why is the outlet important? Because it provides energy. Okay? It's about energy. It's about running the body. It's not about the oxygenation process. It's not necessarily about the oxygen, but it's what needs oxygen to make the most amount of energy. So what am I talking about now? Aerobic respiration. Okay, so you were like completely on the right track when you said muscles need oxygen. Yes. Why do muscles need oxygen? Because in order to contract, it needs energy. Your brain needs oxygen. Yes. Why does your brain need oxygen? Because the brain uses a lot of energy to run. It's about energy. Okay, so oxygen is needed to make the most amount of energy. So how is energy produced? In aerobic respiration. Okay, where does aerobic respiration occur? Think back to your previous chapter. So in muscles, you learned that there was this organelle that takes oxygen and produces a lot of energy. What organelle? think through the organelles. What?
Mitochondria?
Yes, thank you. Okay, so if the purpose of a red blood cell is to carry the gases, particularly oxygen, and you have an organelle that uses oxygen, would you find mitochondria in a red blood cell?
No.
Exactly. Okay, so you would find no, because of this, you would find no nucleus, but you will also find no mitochondria. It should make sense, right? Because you would find no mitochondria. Why? Because mitochondria would use up the oxygen, and the purpose of the red blood cell is to bring the oxygen to different areas of your body. So you would not find mitochondria in the red blood cells. Okay, at least not in an adult red blood cell, a mature red blood cell. Okay, all right. Let's see what else. So no nucleus, no mitochondria, lives for about 120 days. And now we're ready to talk about, what are the building blocks of red blood cells?
Hemoglobin?
Yes. And that has been a test question in the past. So building block of red blood cell is hemoglobin. What's hemoglobin? Break down hemoglobin for me.
It has the heme group.
Yes,
Something
is-
with 4.
that is correct. So you've got the heme group and the globin chains. But essentially, you can define hemoglobin as a pigment. It's a pigment that carries the gases. Okay, so you're right. You've got 4 heme groups. And a bunch of globin chains. The heme groups look something like this. It looks like a wheel. There's 4 of them. And what is the heme group responsible for doing?
It carries oxygen.
That's right. And that also has been a test question in the past. What specific component carries oxygen? You would say heme groups. Oxygen. Where the globin chains, what are globin chains?
They're protein?
Yes. And these proteins are responsible for carrying what?
Carbon dioxide.
Yes. Okay. Which a lot of you, when you did hypoxemia, was it hypoxemia? No, when you did, when you answered one, I think it was on the worksheet, answered how gases are carried, you left out that carbon dioxide can be carried by globin chains. It's not a lot, but it's enough to mention it. Okay. So you want to make sure that when you're talking about how these gases are carried, you do mention all of the ways in which they're carried. Okay. So oxygen is mainly carried by hemoglobin. Like 95% is carried by hemoglobin. And then the rest is carried by what? Or in what form? As a dissolved gas in plasma. Okay. All right. Now we talk about the heme groups, right? And how it carries oxygen, and the globin chains, how it carries carbon dioxide. So how exactly does the heme group carry oxygen? So these are the pigments. So is it the pigments in heme that actually carry the oxygen or something else?
Is
So
it iron?
Yes, thank you. So it turns out that pigment itself, it doesn't have a very high affinity, meaning it doesn't bind to oxygen readily. And that's why included with the pigment, you find iron. So iron attaches to the pigment and then oxygen binds to the heme groups through the iron. Okay. And that's why iron is important in your diet, because without iron, you can become anemic, because you can have all the heme groups you want, but if there's no iron, it can't bind to oxygen. Okay. All right. Questions? All right. So let me zoom back out. Oh, I had this whole page. Oh well, I'll have to remember that for next time. That's okay. So now we're gonna go through the life cycle of a red blood cell. Where are red blood cells made? Where are red blood cells made?
In the bone marrow?
Yes. So you have bone marrow in the medullary cavity, you have bone marrow in the spongy bone. Okay. So red blood cells are made in bone marrow. What stimulates the production of red blood cells? You know this. A lot of you did your presentation on hypoxemia. Erythropoietin, EPO for short. Where's erythropoietin produced? By the liver and the kidneys. Okay. Why would the liver and the kidney produce erythropoietin? Whenever your body senses low levels of what?
Oxygen.
Thank you. So low levels, oops, I put the arrow in the wrong way. Let me delete that. Get back. So low levels of oxygen stimulate the liver and the kidney to produce erythropoietin. Erythropoietin then stimulates the red bone marrow to produce red blood cells. And increase of red blood cell means what? Because the function of red blood cells is to carry oxygen. Increase of red blood cell means increase of oxygen. Okay, so that's one process. Okay, so that's how red blood cells are made. Once they're made, they're going to carry the oxygen and increase that, right? Now, there's no nucleus, which means that as they move through membranes to get in from the blood vessel into the tissue areas to drop off the oxygen, pick up the carbon dioxide, they can get damaged. So in about 120 days, as they're doing this cycle of picking up and dropping off oxygen, picking up oxygen, dropping it off, picking up, and so on. Okay. So in about 120 days, it dies. When it dies, where does it go to? What collects damaged red blood cells?
Is it the liver and spleen?
Very good. Okay. So in the liver and the spleen, the red blood cells are going to be broken down into the functional units, which are called what again? Hemoglobin. And then the hemoglobin breaks down further into the heme groups and into the globin chains. The globin chains are protein essentially, right? Correct? Correct?
Yes.
Okay. So they're going to be broken down further into amino acids because that's what makes proteins. And these amino acids are just recycled, reused to make different or more proteins. Okay, so that's relatively straightforward. The heme is a little bit different. The heme consists of the pigments and the iron. Okay, so the pigment component of the heme has one pathway and the iron has another. The iron is just going to be reused. Reused, recycled, or it could be lost. How can you lose the iron? Like if you have a bleed, if you have trauma and you're bleeding, you can lose iron that way. Or women experience what processes where they lose a lot of iron?
Menstruation.
And that's why when women are menstruating, they can become anemic. Okay. The pigment, the heme, is going to head towards the liver. And it's going to go through a bunch of transitions. Heme it's going to go into bilirubin, and then bile. Okay, so eventually becomes bile, and the bile then will be excreted through what?
Feces.
Excreted into feces. And that's the life cycle. Questions? Okay. So then that's just the red blood cells. Then we have plasma. So for plasma, make sure you know the functions, the components, and the plasma proteins. Okay. So let's go through components. What are the components of plasma? What's the main component of plasma? And feel free to chat if you are not able to unmute, but if you can unmute and say it, please do. What's the main component of plasma? It's water. Okay, so the main component of plasma is water, and it also has other things. it pretty much carries everything, right? It's going to carry the waste products. It's going to carry the nutrients. It's going to carry lipids, hormones, etc. It's the transportation. So it's got water, and it's got plasma proteins, and then it's got other. So we're going to talk about plasma proteins. Okay. So amongst the plasma protein, there's a lot. If you look in your textbook, there's a long list, but there's only 3 main ones I want you to know. Okay. So there's a lot of plasma proteins, but there are 3 main ones. What are the 3 main ones that I want you to know?
Fibrinogen.
Yes, thank you. Fibrinogen. Now take a look at this. Fibrinogen, okay? Anytime you see the word ogen right here, it means inactive. Ogen means inactive, and you'll see it more often, especially in the digestive system, right? So fibrinogen is the inactive form that will convert into fibrin, and fibrin is the actual plasma protein that does what?
Clotting.
Yeah. Which makes sense, right? Because do you want fibrin to exist in your bloodstream as plasma? No, you don't want clotting, right? Unless what happens? Unless you have trauma, right? Like if you have a cut in something. So there are proteins on the outside of a blood vessel. If you have a cut, enters in, and that's what converts fibrinogen into fibrin, and then that's when clots happen. Because clots is a positive feedback, which means it can be dangerous, right? It's meant to protect you, but it could potentially be dangerous and cause things like strokes, heart attacks, and such by blocking blood vessels. Okay? What's another plasma protein?
Albumin.
Yes. Albumin became my best friend when my dad had to get a lot of paracentesis. So my dad had liver problems, so there was buildup in his tummy, buildup of fluid. And to remove that fluid, they had to do paracentesis. Essentially, they poked in his tummy and drew the fluid out. But when they drew the fluid out, they also drew a lot of the albumin. And albumin is really important because it is what does what?
It maintains the blood pH.
Indirectly, yes. But directly, what does it do?
Maintains osmotic pressure.
Yes. So we have 2 terms I want you to know. Osmolarity and viscosity. Osmolarity is how much water is present, and viscosity is how thick it is. Okay, so that's why albumin is so important. It determines how much water and how thick your blood is because it's plasma. It determines how much water stays in, how much water moves out. Okay, so that's the function of albumin. And by doing that indirectly, it affects the pH levels. All right, so that's albumin. And what's the third one?
Globulin.
Yes. Okay, so with the globulins, another way of saying this is antibodies. Okay, and that helps us determine what antibodies are. A lot of students think that antibodies are cells, but they're not. They're actually plasma proteins. there are a lot of different types of antibodies, so not all of them are found in plasma. Some are found in tissues, some are found in different areas, like milk, for example. Okay, but globulins can be antibodies. Okay, so there are 3 types of globulins. There's alpha, beta, and gamma. So the ones that are antibodies are the gamma ones. So gamma globulins are antibodies. Okay. You also have alpha and beta, and those are transporters. Alpha and beta. Okay. So amongst the globulins, there's alpha and beta globulins. Those are the transporters, because remember we said that plasma transports everything like waste, nutrients, lipids, hormones, etc. That's how they're being transported, by these alpha and beta globulins. But you also have gamma globulins, which are antibodies, and that provides protection. Okay. Questions? All right. Then we have the leukocytes, or the white blood cells. A good mnemonic to remember is never let monkeys eat bananas. Sounds cruel, but it does give you the list from most abundant to least abundant. So the most abundant white blood cell that you have in your body are neutrophils, followed by lymphocytes, followed by monocytes, then eosinophils, which makes the least abundant white blood cell as basophils. Okay. Another mnemonic to help you remember is Benji. Okay. Benji refers to B as in basophils, eosinophils, and neutrophils, and the fact that they are granulated. Because there are 2 main types of white blood cells. There's granulocytes that have particular proteins in them, like maybe histamines, heparins, and such. And then there are white blood cells that are agranulated. A meaning without. So these don't have granules. Okay. Make sure you go through all of them. Monkeys eat bananas. And just make a chart of what they are. This is what we do as a cognitive map. And I'm going to leave it for you to do because that's part of the studying process. And write down what their functions are. Function and structure. What do they look like? And what they look like, you can just do a drawing. I believe this is also in a worksheet for you. And I usually do structure first and function, but my mind was on function. So for example, neutrophils are phagocytes. That means they eat things. In particular, they attack bacteria. Structurally, they look like this. Sorry, my drawing's a little bit messy. There you go. Okay. So for example, on a test, I can say what elevation of white blood cells would indicate bacterial infections, and you would say neutrophils. Okay. Or I can ask if you had an allergic reaction, what's most likely responsible? Or if you have a viral infection, what most likely is responsible? Okay, so fill that chart out. Then for heart, you want to make sure you know the structure and function as well as the blood flow. And you can do all 3 of these together because that will actually be, it makes more sense. All right. So we can do, and you don't have to be an artist to do this. Just kind of draw a basic heart. Know that it has chambers. It has valves. Okay. All right. So the easiest way to learn about the heart and the blood flow is just to kind of go through all of it together. So usually we start with how does it enter into the heart? So how does blood enter into the heart?
The inferior and superior vena cava.
Very good. Yep. So I'm going to draw that. Here it goes in. And it goes through here. Goes through here. And joins like so. So you labeled, we'll do 1A and 1B. And notice I don't like to write what they are because then this way I can use to quiz myself later on. So 1 is essentially the superior vena cavas. Oops, sorry. My bad. Vena cavas. A is the superior. B is the inferior. And you're right, the next step is that it enters into what?
The atrium.
Which atrium?
The right.
And I'm just going to abbreviate RA for right atrium. And then it passes through this structure right here, which is called the what?
The right AV valve.
Yeah. The right AV valve, or it can be called.
The tricuspid.
Remember, the tricuspid always comes first because you try things before you buy them. So tricuspid before bicuspid, okay? And then it goes, and then the blood passes through there into this chamber, which is number 4. What chamber is that?
The right ventricle.
And then from there, it passes through this valve, which is number 5. What's number 5?
The pulmonary valve.
And then from there, it goes to number 6 before it goes to 7A and 7B. What's number 6?
The pulmonary trunk.
A common mistake is that students write down number 6 as the pulmonary artery. It is an artery, but specifically you must have the term trunk in there to indicate that it will split. Anytime you see the word trunk, it means it's going to split. And it does. It splits into what?
The left and right pulmonary artery.
Yes, ma'am. And if you're looking at this at anatomical position, what's 7A, right or left?
It's the right.
Yes, that's another common mistake students make. So that means 7B is the left. Okay, from here, it enters into 8. And what is 8?
The lungs.
Mm-hmm. You breathe in, you breathe out, you have gas exchange. Okay, so the gas exchange then would take the blood back into the heart through what blood vessels?
The
The
pulmonary.
pulmonary veins.
Yes, ma'am. So that will be what, number 9? So this would be 9B, 9A. So 9 is going to be the pulmonary veins. You have A being the right, B being the left, and then 10, it enters into this chamber, which is the
Left atrium.
passes through this valve, which is the
The bicuspid or
Mhm.
lifting.
Yep, the left AV valve, the bicuspid. It actually has one more name that you do need to know because older doctors use them. The mitral valve. And then number 12 is here. What's number 12?
The left ventricle.
From here it goes to this valve, which is number 13. What's number 13?
The aortic valve.
Mm-hmm. From here it moves up this structure. Now this structure in general has a name, but this portion is 14A, 14B, and 14C. So what is 14 in general?
The aorta.
Mm-hmm. What's A?
The ascending.
Mm-hmm. B?
The aortic arch.
Mm-hmm. And C?
The descending aorta.
Yep. Okay. Now off of 14B, it branches further, and we're going to do that 15A, 15B, and 15C. Okay, I am running out of room, so I'm going to move over here. 15. So what's 15A?
The bronchiocephalic
Brachiocephalic trunk.
trunk.
Because remember, if it's the trunk, what does that imply?
That it splits.
Exactly. So that's going to cover the right subclavian and the right common carotid. Okay, so what would B be then?
The left common carotid artery.
Mm-hmm. And I love that you added artery, because if you don't on the test, you will be marked down half a point. And that leaves C being the
Left subclavian artery.
very good. Okay. And then it just repeats itself. It goes back to 1 and so on. So not bad, right? If we do it in terms of blood flow as well, it helps us to kind of determine structure as well. Okay. But I will add a slide in here. Insert Oh, maybe home. I also recommend that you add the details in here. So the image helps you to understand the structure as well as the blood flow. But I also recommend that you do a cognitive map. For example, arteries. What are all the arteries? List them. The little table. Or the veins. Actually, no, you should as blood vessels. To draw. Erase. Start with chambers. And then list the chambers. You have first the atriums, or if it's plural atria, you have the ventricles. Okay, and then from here, go further into the right, left, and what do they do? Right, left. So receives, so the right atrium receives deoxygenated blood from the vena cavas. The left receives oxygenated blood from the right and left pulmonary veins, and so on. So you've got the chambers, and then you have the valves, and in the valves you have 1, 2, you have the AV valves, you have the semilunar valves. The AV valves, you have 2, you have right AV valve, left AV valve, and then in general, the AV valves always are associated with tendinous cords, and valves in general prevent backflow. Okay, so kind of organize the information into these cognitive maps to help you make sense of things. So the semilunar valves, you have, the reason why they're called semilunar valves is because they have these cusp, these half moons, and that's why it's called semilunar, because they look like half moons, where the AV valves has these little flaps, and that's why they require the tendinous cords to hold them down. Okay, so you should have a cognitive map that looks like this for chambers, valves, and then blood vessels. It's just another way of studying in more detail than this picture. This picture gives you the overall blood flow as well as the structure, but this one will really let you dig deep into the content. Okay. Then cardiac conduction, EKG, that's pretty straightforward. A lot of you did really good job on the EKG and cardiac conduction. So take a look at that. Blood vessels, I recommend making the cognitive map. And your cognitive map should look something like this. You should have the blood vessels, their function, their layers, and unique characteristics. Okay. All right, respiratory system. We are running short on time, so would you like, is there something in here that you'd like me to cover? Otherwise, I'll go into digestive chemical digestion. Any questions in respiration? Any requests to cover things? I saw your homework, so I know a lot of you have taken care of this, the tissue lining as well as the accessory structure, so that's good. Ventilation, there were a few students that made mistakes on ventilation, so I highly recommend looking at that again. And gas exchange, a few of your assignments, sorry, this portion on that the respiratory assignments, there was some areas that could have a little bit more detail. Okay, so all of you did really well in the accessories and tissue lining. A few of you need to work on ventilation as well as gas exchange. So is there a request to do one of those?
Going over gas exchange would be great.
Okay, let's do gas exchange. All right, so gas exchange is divided into two main types. What are the two main types of gas exchange?
Alveolar and systemic.
Close. The second one is correct.
Okay.
But what's the other one? Not alveolar, but pulmonary, because it happens in the lungs. And I often make the same mistake that you do in terms of the systematic or systemic. So systemic means the entire system. In other words, the entire body. Entire body. Okay. All right. So let's take a look at that. So we'll start with pulmonary first. And then we'll do kind of a side-by-side comparison. Okay. So in the pulmonary, you know that anytime you see the word pulmonary, it means lungs. It happens in the lungs. And this happens in the body. Okay, so if it's happening in the lungs, we have to draw alveoli. Actually, I like green. And then from the heart, it's going to bring the blood. So, and then what leaves? Okay. So in pulmonary gas exchange from the heart, so in other words, the pulmonary arteries. The pulmonary arteries is going to be high in what and low in what in terms of gases?
It's going to be high in carbon dioxide,
Yes, ma'am.
low in oxygen.
That is correct. Now, when you breathe, the air that you bring in is not the highest in oxygen, because what's the highest component in air?
Nitrogen.
Yes. Okay. But relative to the blood vessel, it will be higher in oxygen and lower in carbon dioxide. Okay. So then the blood that moves through when you get to the respiratory membrane, there's going to be an exchange because the respiratory membrane is specifically thin enough for that exchange to happen. Okay. So what you're going to find is carbon dioxide moves into the alveoli, where oxygen moves into the capillary. Okay, so by the time the gas exchange is done, here, now the blood vessels, the capillaries will be high in oxygen and low in carbon dioxide. What you're held accountable for is, what is this respiratory membrane? You already know it, right? It's going to have to include something from the capillary. It's going to include a basement membrane that connects the two. It's going to include a layer from the alveoli. So what layer of the capillary am I talking about that allows for this exchange to happen? Remember, there's only one layer in capillaries. It starts with an E.
Epithelium?
Close.
Endothelium.
There you go. Endothelium. Okay. And then the alveoli is going to have what cell that allows for this diffusion to happen? Alveoli has 3 cells. The macrophage cells, the great cells, and the simple squamous cells. So which one do you think allows for the diffusion to happen?
The squamous.
Yes, simple squamous. Because the great cells produce surfactant, and the macrophage cells are immune cells, simple squamous. And that's what makes up the respiratory membrane in the pulmonary system. Okay, all right. So then now that blood vessel goes back to the pulmonary vein. The pulmonary veins go back to the heart, and the heart pumps it to the rest of the body. So we're just going to continue that. So the pulmonary vein essentially goes through the heart and is pumped back out through the form of the aorta. The aorta is going to bring the blood to the rest of the body. Oops, I need that a little bit too. It's fine. And now the cells that we're going to look at are cells of the body. Not alveoli, but cells of the body. Like muscle cells. Now the cells in the body need energy, right? So they need energy, and as a byproduct of producing energy, they use up the oxygen, and what do they make? Come on. They use up the oxygen in metabolism to make what? To make ATP, but what's a byproduct of ATP? Carbon dioxide. Okay, So the blood that is brought to the cells of the tissue is going to be high in what? Because it just came from the lungs and the heart. High
Oxygen,
in what? Yep, high in oxygen and low in.
carbon dioxide,
Perfect. So the membranes between the capillaries and the cells of the body are going to allow for the diffusion. So oxygen is going to go in what direction? Capillary to cells or cells to capillary? It's going to go from the capillary into the cell so that they can produce more energy. And the carbon dioxide in the cells are going to go into the capillaries. So what ends up leaving? The blood that ends up leaving now becomes high in CO2 and low in O2. And that's why it goes back into the heart and switches back to the pulmonary side. Okay, so from pulmonary, let me use a different color. From pulmonary to systemic, and then from systemic to pulmonary. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And this way you can see kind of the interaction between the two. Because it's not separate. I mean, they work together. And you can see that because they go back and forth, it's a closed cycle. It's a closed loop. Okay. All right. Any questions on this? Okay. So if there's something that you don't understand, it's nice to try to see if you can draw out a picture of it to summarize everything. Like when I was going through this class, this is the drawing that I made actually when I was studying. I'm like, oh, now I can see pulmonary by itself, systemic, but I can also see them together. Okay. All right. Digestive. Digestive is wicked. It's a lot of information. So spend a lot of time on digestive. Okay. Cardiovascular is hard too, but it's like 3 separate units where digestive is one with the same amount of content that you find in the 3 units in cardiovascular. So digestive is massive, but it's fun. It's one of my favorite chapters because it's so relatable. I mean, like all of us eat. So all of us understands what happens when we swallow. We can kind of feel the food moving through our bodies. The effects of certain things that we eat. So it's very common sense, even though it's very dense in content. Okay. You want to make sure you are able to describe the functions of the digestive system. Make sure you list and describe the digestive tract, and that one is a nice one for a cognitive map. Just kind of list 1, 2, 3. You know, kind of how food moves through. And I believe some of you chose to do that for your student thing, you know, the worksheet, okay? Then as you move through the body, that cognitive map, you should have the following. You know, make sure you describe the functions of the mouth, what is it lined with, include the lung, the lingual papilla, the lingual frenulum, the palate, the uvula, describe the structure and functions of the teeth, the deciduous teeth versus your permanent teeth, know the 3 glands, the parotid, the sublingual, submandibular, and what do they secrete? In other words, like saliva, what's the component of saliva? Describe the pharynx. The pharynx doesn't have much besides the lining. I mean, it's a pathway, right? Then you have the esophagus. This gets to be a little bit more complex because in the esophagus, you can see the transition of tissues. And then the most complex is the stomach, the small intestine, and the large intestine. But of these, I think the stomach and the small intestine deserves more of your attention because it's complex. You have to know all the cells that line them, all the chemicals and such. The others are, more of like pathways. Okay. Make sure you know how food are digested chemically. Make a cognitive map again here. This is a nice place for a cognitive map to kind of summarize everything in a visual way. Because you may know it, but you have to be able to pull it out of your brain. That's the disconnect a lot of students encounter when they're taking exams is how do you pull the information out? Because if you store the information in like paragraphs, it's really hard to pull out. But if you store the information in your brain as a cognitive map, then you can go, oh, I see the map. Okay, 1, 2, oh, in the third box, I wrote this and this. So it's easier to pull out, okay? So I started a cognitive map for you. I want you to go into more detail into it. So this is, first of all, I love Almond Joy, but in addition to that, Almond Joy has the 3 basic things that you're responsible for knowing, right? So the chocolate represents what? Represents the carbohydrates. The almond represents what?
The protein?
Thank you. I love hearing a voice other than mine. I'm so grateful. And the coconut?
The fats.
Yes. So you can see that these chemicals are broken in different areas, different ways by different chemicals. 3 differences: location, chemical, and mechanical. Okay, so that's why you have to go through the main parts that we talked about earlier: the mouth, the pharynx, the esophagus, the stomach, the intestine, and this including the small and large. Okay, so I started out for you a little bit. So the mouth, which includes the tongue, the teeth, and the salivary glands. The first thing that happens there is ingestion. You're eating it, right? So you're chewing it, okay? And that's why digestion-wise, you're physically, through chewing, mastication, breaking down the components of all 3. But chemically, the saliva is going to contain salivary amylase, and salivary amylase breaks down only carbohydrates. And that's why the chocolate is the first thing to be digested in the mouth. Makes sense, right? So when you eat rice versus when you eat meat, you digest the rice faster, earlier, which is why you feel hungry if all you eat is rice. But if you eat meat or protein, you feel full longer because it takes longer to break down the proteins. Okay? Pharynx, pretty much a pathway. Esophagus, pretty much a pathway. Then when we get to the stomach, in terms of digestion, you have the physical digestion occurring through the rugae, the contraction of those muscles. In terms of chemical digestion, you have pepsinogen and hydrochloric acid. Oh, look at this. Pepsinogen. What does that mean? Ogen.
It means it's inactive.
That's right. So you have pepsinogen in your stomach. It's going to be produced, but it's going to be in its inactive form. So when hydrochloric acid is present, it's going to break it and become pepsin. And it's the pepsin that breaks down protein. So what component of that almond joy is going to be broken down? It's the almond. Okay. And then you have the hydrochloric acid. What's the purpose of the hydrochloric acid? It does help to break things down further as well in general. But it also helps to fight against bacteria because all the foods that you eat, it's going to have contamination. It's going to have bacteria. Okay, and then you can also add gastric lipase. Or did I just not all the way down? Gastric lipase. Okay, so gastric lipase, very minor, but it does kind of start where here is the full-blown digestion of protein. It starts digestion of lipids, but very minor. Okay. So
all
yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
ask a question. So all of these chemicals are always in the stomach,
Yes.
and they're to do what they need to do once you put food in them, right?
Perfect question. And that's a test question. So I can say pepsin, which breaks down protein, is found where? And you would say the stomach. So these chemicals are specifically associated with that location. That's a great question. Okay. So then you're going to want to do the same thing for the small intestine and then the large intestine. The small intestine has a lot, because the pancreas produces a lot that ends up going into the small intestine. The liver, a little bit, and the gallbladder, a little bit. Both of these together will give you the bile. But it's the pancreas that's going to give you a long list of things. Okay, so you want to be able to complete this chart. So that's chemical digestion. But yes, certain chemicals, the majority of chemicals are associated with particular location because in that location, they have cells that will secrete these specific chemicals. Okay, now I left the cells out because here I want you to focus just on chemicals, because sometimes when you are having too much information, you miss kind of understanding the connection. So here, what you can do is that you can first run through with just the chemicals and keep it simple. And then you can add, like, for example, what cell produces that? What cell produces that? Yeah, you have to know it, but studying things simply first and then adding on more information is an easier way for your brain to upload the information. Okay, just think like a file. If you upload a smaller file, it uploads really fast. But if you upload a really large file, it's slower, plus it can glitch, right? So that's like us in terms of learning. Learn the simple things piece by piece, and then you can kind of put it all together. That's why learning is a process. It doesn't happen overnight. Okay, questions?
I know you mentioned that pancreas has a lot of chemicals, right?
Mhm.
I'm just having trouble understanding and trying to simplify it. The pancreatic juice,
Yes.
is that something that's already in there, or is it something that gets created as we eat?
So the pancreas is going to secrete the enzymes, which is called the pancreatic juice in general. Is a generic term for all the things that it produces, like pancreatic lipase, pancreatic amylase, chymotrypsin, procarboxy, and so on. Okay, so all that is the pancreatic juices, but it's going to be secreted and then go into the small intestine.